The day they erased us from the official record, I was sitting in a waiting room on Theta Station, holding a coffee that had gone cold, and I remember thinking, they have absolutely no idea what they just started. My name is Sera Voss. I am 67 years old. I spent 19 years as a trade economist for the United Earth Commerce Directorate, 11 years as Earth's senior diplomatic attaché for economic affairs, and the last 6 years as the sole human representative to the Galactic Council's Resource Allocation Subcommittee, a body whose name sounds important and whose actual function, in practice, was to ensure that the 5 founding species of the Council received preferential access to every critical resource corridor in charted space, while everyone else filed paperwork. I know waiting rooms. I have spent more hours in the waiting rooms of the Galactic Council than I have spent sleeping in my own bed in the last decade. The chairs in this particular room were designed for Vethrani physiology, which meant they were too wide and too shallow for a human body, and the lighting was tuned to a frequency that the Vethrani found calming, and that gave me, after more than 40 minutes of exposure, a headache that started behind my left eye and radiated outward in a way that felt almost deliberate. I had been waiting for 6 hours. The session had been scheduled for 09. It was now 15:14 station time. I had not been called. I had not been given an updated schedule. The aide who had checked me in, a young Vethrani female whose name translated as something like third administrative voice of the Eastern Processing Hall, and who I had taken to calling internally, the one who will not make eye contact, had appeared twice in the doorway to tell me the session was running long and that my presence was still required. I knew what was happening inside the chamber. I had known for 3 weeks. The deletion order had been drafted by the Vethrani Reach's legal team, reviewed by the Arathi Conclave's treaty specialists, and quietly co-signed by representatives of the Shen Collective before it ever appeared on a formal agenda. My source was not a spy and not a leak. My source was a Vethrani junior clerk named Osevith, who had worked in the subcommittee's administrative division for 11 years, and who had, over the course of 4 of those years, developed what I can only describe as a conscience, the specific inconvenient variety that manifests in a bureaucrat when they realize that the paperwork they are processing is being used to hurt people. Osevith had transmitted the draft text to my secured communicator at 02:17 station time on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago. I had read it in bed, in the dark, on a device that was not connected to any council network. Then I had lain in the dark for a long time, looking at the ceiling, and I had thought about a woman named Dr. Amara Osei-Bonsu, who had died 11 years ago in a research facility beneath the Kalahari Desert, and about the things she had spent the last 22 years of her life building, and about the fact that she had made me promise, at the end, that I would not let them win. I had promised at 15:47 station time. The door to the hearing chamber opened, and the Vethrani presiding officer, a senior administrator, whose name translated as the voice that closes proceedings, and who had, in my experience, never closed a proceeding in fewer than 4 hours, stepped into the waiting room and looked at me with the particular expression the Vethrani use when they are delivering information they expect to be distressing and have decided to perform sympathy about it. "Representative Voss," he said. His translator bead rendered his tone as formally regretful. His secondary feeding tendrils, which the Vethrani retract when they are relaxed and extend when their nervous system is under stress, were fully retracted. He was not stressed, he was comfortable. "The subcommittee has concluded its session. I wasn't called in," I said. "The session did not require your testimony." He paused in the way that species with translator beads pause when they are choosing words that will sound better than the reality they are describing. "The subcommittee has passed Resolution 7741C. Earth's membership status has been reclassified as lapsed pending formal review. Your vessel's diplomatic immunity designation has been suspended. Human trade routes have been reclassified as unregistered commercial corridors, effective in 30 galactic days." I let the silence sit for a moment. "Lapsed," I said. "The term reflects the administrative reality of Earth's failure to comply with the Asteroid Belt Mineral Rights Accord over the proceeding." "I know what the term reflects," I said. "Thank you for informing me personally." I picked up my cold coffee. I stood. I collected my data slate from the chair beside me, and I walked to the door. Representative Voss. His voice came from behind me, still formally regretful, still comfortable. The review process will take approximately 18 months. During that time, Earth retains observer status. You are, of course, welcome to continue attending sessions in that capacity. I turned around just far enough to look at him directly. I held that for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said, "I appreciate that," and I walked out. The corridor was long and white and cold. I walked it at the same pace I had walked every corridor on Theta Station for 6 years, unhurried, measured, the pace of someone who has somewhere to be and is not concerned about whether anyone else approves of the destination. Osivith was waiting near the docking bay access, which was not something I had arranged and not something I had expected. The young clerk was standing against the wall with their color panels set to a muted gray that in Vethrani body language indicated something between apology and distress. They did not speak. They held out a small data chip, the kind used for personal communications, too small to be detected by standard council security scans. I took it without stopping walking. "Thank you, Osivith," I said without turning my head. I heard the soft sound of their feet moving away in the opposite direction. My shuttle was in Bay 19. It took me 8 minutes to reach it. I sat in the pilot seat, and I did not engage the engines immediately. I looked out the forward viewport at the dead star that Theta Station orbited, a white dwarf, dim and dense, giving off almost no light, and I thought about the farmers on Kepler's Reach, who had been trying to ship their grain harvest for 6 months through a council-designated corridor that the Arathi conclave had been systematically slowing through customs inspection delays. Technically legal, thoroughly deliberate, the kind of slow strangulation that leaves no marks. I thought about the medical convoy that had been turned back from the outer Meridian colonies 4 times in 8 months due to documentation irregularities that the Council's administrative office kept losing the correction filings for. I thought about 30 galactic days, and what 30 galactics meant for 340,000 human ships that would, at the end of that period, be sailing without diplomatic immunity through space controlled by species that had just been handed legal permission to treat them as unregistered commercial traffic. Then I inserted Osivith's data chip into the shuttle's secured reader. The message was 12 words. It said, "Phase 2 authorization confirmed. The distribution nodes have been standing by for your signal. I set the course for Earth." And for the first time in 6 years of sitting in waiting rooms that were not designed for my body, under lighting that gave me headaches, waiting to be called into rooms where decisions about human lives were made without human input, I felt something settle in my chest that had been tight for a very long time. They had deleted us from the record. They were about to discover what we had been writing in the margins. I want to tell you about Dr. Amara Osei-Bonsu, because you cannot understand what happened next without understanding her first, and because she deserves to be understood. Amara was born in Accra in 2041, the 3rd child of an economist father and a physician mother, and she spent the first 30 years of her professional life doing something that sounded, to people who did not understand it, extremely boring. She was a supply chain architect. She mapped the movement of goods through complex systems. She modeled dependencies. She identified single points of failure. She asked, with the specific patience of someone who has decided that the most important question in any system is not, "How does this work?" but "What happens when it stops?" The question that no one else in the room wanted to sit with. What breaks first, and who suffers when it does? She asked that question about the Galactic Council's economic infrastructure in 2063. 14 years after humanity had been admitted to membership, and the answer she produced, a 600-page document submitted to the Earth Joint Intelligence Review Board under a classification level so high that it did not officially exist in any filing system, was the most consequential piece of economic analysis in the history of human civilization. The Council, she wrote, was not held together by politics or military power or the collective goodwill of its 412 member species. It was held together by supply chains, by the movement of specific critical goods, medical compounds, rare industrial catalysts, biological regulators, agricultural stabilizers, through distribution networks that had evolved over 300 years into a system of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary fragility. The complexity was visible. The fragility was not. No single species controlled enough of the network to weaponize it deliberately, but the network had dependencies, choke points, places where the removal of a single supplier, a single routing hub, a single distributor would cascade outward in ways that the Council's economic modeling systems, which were impressive but which had been built by species who assumed the system would always include all its current participants, had never been asked to calculate. Amara had calculated them. It had taken her 4 years. The report's conclusion was 8 pages long, and its final paragraph has since been declassified and published widely enough that most people on Earth can quote the relevant section from memory. What it said, in the careful language of an economist who understood that she was describing something that had never been done before and might not be legal in several jurisdictions, was this: that a species willing to spend 30 to 40 years quietly inserting itself into the specific dependencies she had identified, not as a visible, registered, traceable supplier, but as an invisible layer of infrastructure beneath the infrastructure everyone could see, would, at the end of that period, hold a lever that had no name in any existing political or military doctrine. Not a weapon, not a threat, a fact, an architectural fact about how the galaxy worked, built so slowly and so carefully that by the time anyone thought to look for it, removing it would be indistinguishable from destroying the system itself. The Joint Intelligence Review Board argued about the report for 7 months. Then they voted to fund what became known internally, in the facility beneath the Kalahari, where Amara spent the next 22 years of her life, as Project Meridian. I need to be precise about what Project Meridian was not, because the word that comes to mind for most people when they hear this story is infiltration, and that word implies deception in a way that is not quite accurate. Project Meridian did not insert fake companies or fraudulent identities into the galactic economy. Every entity it created was real. Every product it supplied was genuine and was genuinely needed. Every relationship it built was built on actual value delivered over years and decades to partners who received exactly what they were promised. The deception, such as it was not in the product. It was in the origin, because none of the 847 companies, cooperatives, distribution hubs, and supply partnerships that Project Meridian created over 41 years had a human name on their registration documents. None of them flew a human flag or listed a human world as their primary operating address. They were registered through a cascade of legal entities across 31 species, minor members, junior partners, small civilizations that had their own reasons to maintain relationships with Earth that they preferred not to advertise, and the human involvement in their ownership and operation was buried in layers of legal architecture so precisely constructed that Amara's legal team, which she built over 6 years from the most talented treaty lawyers on Earth, had specifically verified that every layer was technically, completely, and absolutely legitimate under Council commercial law. We had not broken the rules. We had read them more carefully than anyone else. Project Meridian's operations were organized into 3 divisions, which Amara named with the specific practicality of someone who did not have patience for dramatic program titles. The first was called Distribution Infrastructure. Over 31 years, starting with small contracts for agricultural biologics and expanding steadily into pharmaceutical compounds, industrial catalysts, and the specific category of biological regulators, without which the Vethrani Reach's medical system would develop critical supply shortfalls within approximately 4 months. Project Meridian's distribution entities had become, without anyone noticing, the dominant supplier in 37 specific product categories that the Council's economic monitoring systems classified as non-strategic secondary goods, because they were not glamorous and because the species who supplied them had never, in 300 years of galactic commerce, been the kind of species anyone thought to watch carefully. The second division was called routing. The Council's logistics network was vast and visible. What was less visible was the layer beneath it. The smaller regional hubs, the secondary relay points, the last kilometer distribution nodes that connected the Council's main arteries to the specific facilities, hospitals, research stations, agricultural processing centers, and manufacturing installations that actually needed the goods being moved. Project Meridian's entities had, over 29 years, become the operators of 34% of those secondary nodes across Council space. They were the part of the supply chain that the Council's senior economic analysts thought of the way you think of the pipes in a building you live in, as infrastructure so basic and so unglamorous that it simply must be working because nothing has gone wrong yet. The third division was called documentation. This is the part that Amara considered her most important work, and I agree with her. Over 40 years, a team of 600 analysts embedded in Project Meridian's legal and administrative operations had been maintaining something she called the dependency map, a continuously updated, fully verified, legally sourced record of exactly which Council institutions, on which worlds, in which systems, depended on Project Meridian's distribution network, for which specific goods, updated quarterly, cross-referenced against the Council's own public health and economic data to ensure accuracy. The dependency map was not a weapon, it was a fact. The most precisely documented fact in human history. When I met Amara, she was 71 years old, and she had been living in the Kalahari facility for so long that she had a garden in her quarters, which she said was the only way she could remember what sunlight looked like. She was small and precise, and she had the specific manner of someone who has spent decades working on something they cannot discuss in public. A quality of self-containment that does not come from secrecy, but from the discipline of choosing every word carefully, because the wrong word, to the wrong person, in the wrong context, could unravel something that 40 years of work had built. She told me about Project Meridian over 3 days. She used a whiteboard. She showed me the dependency map for the first time on the morning of the second day, and I sat in front of it for a long time without speaking, because the thing it showed, the precise shape of how deeply Project Meridian had embedded itself into the Council's circulatory system, was not what I had been expecting. I had been expecting something impressive. I had not been expecting something that looked, if I am being honest, almost like the Council's survival. "This is not a threat," Amara said, watching me look at it. "No," I said. "It's a fact." She smiled. It was the smile of someone who has been waiting for someone else to use the right word for a long time. She died 2 years later. Cardiac event, quiet, in her garden, during what her assistant described as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The facility held a private memorial. Her family was told, eventually, what she had built. Her daughter, who is a physician in Nairobi, stood in front of the dependency map for almost an hour without speaking, and then said something that I have thought about regularly since. She said, "She always told us she was working on logistics." I said, "She was." The activation sequence for Project Meridian did not require a dramatic command. It required a single encrypted signal transmitted through a pulsar relay that Project Meridian's astronomical team had been maintaining for 11 years. Embedded in the routine navigation data that every human ship in the network received as a matter of standard practice, the signal reached the first distribution node 8 hours after I transmitted it from my shuttle, 0 kilometers outside Theta Station's orbital zone. What happened next did not happen loudly. This is important to understand. There were no explosions, no ship movements, no military posturing of any kind. Nothing that the Council's sensor networks, which were extensive, and which were very good at detecting the things they had been built to detect. Weapons discharge, vessel mobilization, communication surges that might indicate coordinated military activity, would register as a threat. What happened was administrative. Across 847 distribution entities operating in 37 product categories across Council space, routine operations simply became less routine. Shipments that had been scheduled for delivery in the next 14 days were placed under internal review pending documentation verification. Routing confirmations for the next 90 days were paused pending updated compliance audits. Secondary distribution nodes executed standard maintenance protocols that, according to their operating contracts, which Project Meridian's legal teams had spent years ensuring contained provisions that were tedious to read but precise in their implications, required a 21-day operational suspension during any audit cycle. None of this was illegal. All of it was documented. The Council's economic monitoring system did not flag it for 4 days. When it did flag it, the alert was categorized as a medium priority supply chain variance notification, the kind generated several times a month by the normal friction of galactic commerce, and it was routed to a junior analyst in the Resource Allocation Subcommittee's Administrative Division, who had a backlog of 340 similar notifications and who processed it in the order it was received. I was back on Earth by then, in a briefing room in Geneva that I had not entered in 6 years, watching the Council's internal economic feeds on a screen that one of Project Meridian's technical team had wired directly into the room. The technical lead for Project Meridian's operations division was a man named Kwame Asante, who had joined the program at 32 and was now 59, and who had the specific calm of someone who has run very precise operations for a very long time and has learned to distinguish between the silence that means nothing is happening and the silence that means everything is happening correctly. He sat beside me with a cup of tea and a tablet displaying the dependency map, watching supply chain variance notifications accumulate in the Council's internal system, and said, "Day 7 is when the Vethrani medical network will start feeling it." "How bad?" I asked. "Not dangerous," he said. "Not yet. Uncomfortable. The specific category of biological regulators their secondary care facilities use, the distribution queue for those, runs through 4 of our nodes in their southern reach. When those nodes go into audit suspension, the queue backs up. Their facilities start drawing from emergency reserves. It takes about a week before a senior administrator notices the reserves moving, and then they file a complaint with the Council's Supply Coordination Office," he said, "who will spend approximately 3 days determining that the entities involved are operating within their contractual rights, and approximately 2 more days determining that those entities are not technically human or not visibly human, and approximately another 2 days trying to figure out why 37 separate product categories are experiencing simultaneous audit cycles." He paused. "That's when they'll call us," he said. He was right about the timeline. He was wrong about one detail. They did not call us. They called the Council's Emergency Economic Committee, which convened on day 9, 5 days after the first notifications and 4 days after the Vethrani Medical Network's reserve consumption began to spike. The committee's senior analyst, a Shen collective cluster named 14 Resonant, issued a preliminary assessment within 6 hours. The assessment identified the supply chain variance as statistically anomalous. The probability of 37 independent product categories experiencing simultaneous documentation audit cycles as a result of uncoordinated coincidence was, 14 Resonant calculated, effectively 0. The assessment flagged coordinated action as the probable cause. It did not identify the coordinating party. It could not identify the coordinating party because the entities involved were registered across 31 species, none of whom were human, and because the layered legal architecture of Project Meridian's ownership structure would have required a forensic economic investigation of a scope and duration that the Council's oversight bodies had not conducted in their entire history, because they had never, in 300 years of operation, encountered a situation that required it. The Council's intelligence services spent 4 days trying to find a human fingerprint on anything. They found nothing, not because we had hidden well, because Amara had been right 30 years ago when she told the Joint Intelligence Review Board that the deception was not in the product. Every entity was real. Every supply was genuine. Every legal structure was clean. There was nothing to find because there was nothing hidden. There was only a fact. And the fact was that the Council, in the 4 days it spent trying to identify the human involvement, had not yet asked the question that mattered. It had been asking who is doing this. It had not yet asked what happens if it doesn't stop. On day 14, the Vethrani Reach's chief medical administrator submitted an emergency request to the Council's Supply Coordination Office for priority rerouting of biological regulator shipments to 17 secondary care facilities experiencing reserve depletion. The request was standard in format and extraordinary in what it revealed: that the facilities in question had been operating on reserves for 11 days, that their standard resupply pipeline had been operating through entities currently in audit suspension, and that no alternative suppliers for the specific compound variants they required had been identified because those compound variants were produced in the specific formulations they required by 4 manufacturers, 3 of which were currently in audit suspension, and the 4th of which had a 9-month order queue. The Council's Supply Coordination Office forwarded the request to the Economic Emergency Committee. The Economic Emergency Committee forwarded it to the Presiding Council's executive session. The executive session met on day 15. I know what was said in that session because Osei-Bonsu, who had by then quietly transferred to a position in the Council's Administrative Archive Division, had access to the session's summary documentation and transmitted it to me through a method that I will not describe in this account, out of respect for Osei-Bonsu's continued employment. The presiding officer opened the session by asking the Intelligence Services Director to present his findings on the origin of the supply chain disruption. The director's findings took 11 minutes to present. The summary was, they did not know. The presiding officer then asked the Economic Emergency Committee to present the projected impact of continued disruption 1-4. Resonance assessment took 23 minutes to present. The summary was, significant. 17 Vethrani medical facilities were at reserve depletion within 19 days. 4 Arathi agricultural processing centers would experience input shortfalls affecting roughly 12% of their regional food processing capacity within 28 days. 3 Shen collective research installations would lose access to specific industrial catalysts required for ongoing projects within 22 days, with research continuity impacts that 14 Resonant rated as substantial. And those were only the direct impacts traceable to the current audit suspensions. The secondary and tertiary cascade effects. The things that happened when those facilities couldn't function, to the things those facilities supplied, to the things that depended on those supplies, extended outward in ways that 14 resonance modeling systems were still calculating, and that 14 resonance said, in the summary document, with the specific precision of an intelligence that does not soften its assessments to make them more comfortable to receive, it did not yet have full confidence in, because the network was more complex than the Council's standard modeling tools had been designed to map. The presiding officer asked whether the disruption could be rerouted around the affected entities. 14 Resonant said, not in the relevant timeframe. No. The presiding officer asked whether the affected entities could be legally compelled to resume operations. The Council's senior legal advisor said, not under existing commercial law, no, because the audit suspension provisions in their operating contracts were legitimate, and because compelling a private commercial entity to terminate a legitimate internal audit process would set a precedent that would apply equally to every commercial entity operating in Council space, including the ones owned by the founding 5 species. The presiding officer asked whether there was any mechanism by which the Council could directly acquire or operate the affected distribution infrastructure. The legal advisor said, not without a treaty process requiring ratification by 2/3 of the membership, which would take a minimum of 4 months. There was a silence in the session that the summary document described as extended. Then the presiding officer asked the question that the Council had not asked in the 9 days since this started. She asked, do we know if this is connected to the deletion of Earth's membership status 14? Resonant said, we cannot confirm a connection. The legal advisor said, we cannot confirm a connection through available evidence. The intelligence director said, we cannot confirm a connection. And then, according to Osei-Bonsu's transmission, a junior member of the Economic Emergency Committee, a Vethrani analyst named something that translated as fourth voice of the Eastern Economic Cluster, said something that was not in her brief and that caused the session summary to note a procedural interruption by a non-senior committee member. She said, with respect, the question is not whether we can confirm it. The question is whether we believe it. And I would like to know whether anyone in this room genuinely believes this is a coincidence. The session summary recorded a second extended silence. Then the presiding officer said, contact Earth's observer representative. The message arrived at my communicator on day 16 at 06:22 Geneva time while I was eating breakfast. It was from the office of the Council's presiding officer, which was itself remarkable, Because in 6 years as Earth's senior economic representative, I had received exactly 2 direct communications from the presiding officer's office, both of them procedural. The presiding officer did not typically communicate with junior member representatives directly. The presiding officer communicated with the council's full members. Junior members, observer members, lapsed members, those went through the administrative channels, through the aides, through the subcommittees, through the waiting rooms. The message did not come through any of those. It was direct. It was addressed to me by name, and it said, in language that the presiding officer's office usually reserved for communications between the founding 5 species, that the presiding officer would appreciate the opportunity to speak with Representative Voss at the earliest possible convenience regarding a matter of mutual economic concern. I read it twice. Then I put down my coffee and transmitted a response. I said, I am available immediately. The call connected within 4 minutes. The presiding officer, Councillor Veyet, an elderly Vethrani who had held her position for 90 years and who was, in my experience, the single most genuinely impartial individual in the council's entire apparatus, appeared on my screen looking, for the first time in my recollection, like someone carrying a weight she had not been carrying the last time I saw her. Representative Voss, she said, thank you for responding quickly. Of course, I said. I will be direct with you, she said, which was, among the Vethrani, a significant statement. Directness in Vethrani diplomatic culture was not the default register. It was something you announced to signal that what followed should be received as unusually sincere. The Council is experiencing supply chain disruptions that our analysis suggests may be connected to the passage of Resolution 7741. I see, I said. We are not in a position to confirm that connection through available evidence, she said. But I am contacting you because I believe personally, as distinct from institutionally, that the correct response to a situation whose origin we cannot trace and whose impact we cannot immediately remediate is to speak directly with the party most likely to understand it. I looked at her for a moment. Councillor Veyet, I said, what is it that you'd like to know? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I would like to know whether this can be resolved. Yes, I said, it can be resolved. What would resolution require? I picked up my data slate. I had been carrying the document on it for 6 years, revised and updated quarterly, verified by the same legal teams that had built Project Meridian's ownership architecture, reviewed in its current form 3 times in the last 3 weeks. I'd like to schedule a formal session, I said. Not with the subcommittee, with the full council. I have a presentation I'd like to deliver. Councillor Veyet looked at me steadily. How long will you need, she said. Not long, I said. The document does most of the work. The Grand Conclave Chamber was arranged differently when I entered it for the 2nd time in 6 years. The last time I had walked to the center podium, I had done so as a junior member representative attending a resource allocation hearing that I had not been permitted to speak at. I had sat in the observer gallery and watched the founding 5 species allocate themselves 73% of a disputed mineral corridor and file it under equitable distribution. This time, I walked to the center podium and I placed my data slate on the lectern and I looked out at 412 species in their seats, and I felt something I had not felt in 6 years of sitting in waiting rooms under bad lighting. I felt calm. Councillor Veyet opened the session with the specific brevity she used when she wanted the chamber to understand that she considered the matter serious. Earth's observer representative has requested a formal address to the full council regarding Resolutions 7741C and its economic implications, she said. Representative Voss, you have the floor. I activated my data slate. Thank you. Councillor, I said. I'll be brief. What I displayed on the chamber's main screen was not the dependency map itself. The dependency map was 600 pages and contained operational details that Project Meridian's security protocols did not permit me to display publicly. What I displayed was a summary, a clean, precise, 40-page document that 14 resonance own economic modeling systems could verify against publicly available supply chain data in approximately 3 hours. It showed, in the specific language of economic infrastructure analysis, exactly what Project Meridian's distribution network supplied, to whom, in what quantities, through what routing pathways, and what the projected cascade impacts would be if that network remained in audit suspension for 30, 60, and 90 days respectively. The 30-day column was uncomfortable. The 60-day column was serious. The 90-day column, which included secondary and tertiary cascade effects that 14 resonance modeling systems had by then fully calculated, and which were, I had been told, consistent with what Amara's original 2063 analysis had projected, was the column that caused a senior Vethrani delegate in the third tier of seating to stand up without being recognized and say something in his own language that his translator bead rendered, with admirable fidelity, as this cannot be accurate. It is accurate, I said. Your own Economic Committee's senior analyst has the underlying data and has had 4 days to verify it. I would invite Councillor Veit to confirm whether 14 resonance assessment is consistent with what I'm showing. Councillor Veit said without hesitation, "It is consistent." The chamber was quiet in a way that chambers with 4 and 12 species are very rarely quiet. I let it sit. Then I said, "Earth is not at war with the Council. Earth has not taken a military action. Earth has not violated a single provision of any treaty currently in force. What Earth has done is participate for 41 years in the galactic economy, as a supplier, as a distributor, as a logistics partner, through entities that are registered, legitimate, and operating entirely within Council commercial law." I paused. "The entity involved in the current audit suspension will resume normal operations when 3 conditions are met: a formal reversal of Resolution CB741C, restoration of full member status for Earth, and the establishment of a permanent human seat on the Resource Allocation Committee, not observer status, not junior member status, a full voting seat." The Vethrani delegate who had stood without being recognized said, "You are holding the Council's medical supply chain hostage." "No," I said. "I am describing a fact about how the galactic economy works. The entities currently in audit suspension are conducting legitimate internal reviews. They will conclude those reviews when they have received the documentation they require. The documentation they require is a copy of the Council resolution reversing 7741C. I looked at him directly. I didn't build the dependency. The Council built the dependency over 30 years by not looking carefully at who was supplying what. There was another silence. Councillor Veit said, "The chair will call a recess for committee consultation." The recess lasted 4 hours. I sat in a different waiting room, this one with better chairs, because it was the room used for senior member representatives, and I had been placed there without anyone explicitly acknowledging why. And I drank tea and read reports from Kwame's team about supply chain metrics and did not speak to the 11 different aides who came to find me with various versions of, "Surely there is a more informal path to resolution." When the session resumed, the vote on restoring Earth's full member status passed by 341 to 47, with 24 abstentions. The Vethrani voted against, along with 2 of their close treaty partners. The founding 5 species, for the first time in Council history, did not vote as a bloc. The Vethrani and the Shen Collective both voted in favor. The vote on the Permanent Resource Allocation Committee seat passed by 289 to 103. In the corridor afterward, the Vethrani presiding officer, the one who had met me in the waiting room 16 days ago, comfortable and formally regretful, found me near the exit to the docking bays. His translator bead was active. He used it anyway. "How long?" he said. "How long were you building this?" I looked at him for a moment. "The woman who started it died 11 years ago," I said. "She never saw it finished." He was quiet. His feeding tendrils, which he could not fully control, were extended. "The audit suspensions," he said. "They will end?" "They are ending now," I said. Kwame had transmitted the confirmation 12 minutes ago. "Your medical facilities should see normalized supply flow within 72 hours. He looked at me with an expression I did not have a name for in Vethrani body language because I had never seen it before. It was not fear, and it was not anger, and it was not the comfortable performative sympathy he had worn when he told me Earth had been deleted. It was something simpler. It was the expression of a species that has just discovered that the waiting room it put another species in for 6 years was itself inside a building that the other species owned. I left him in the corridor. Halangra. I built a house on Kepler's Reach 3 years after the vote. I had not planned to retire there. I had planned to stay in Geneva, to continue the work, to sit on the Resource Allocation Committee, and make myself useful in the gradual, unglamorous way that Amara had always said was the only way anything actually changed. And I did stay in Geneva for 2 years, and I did sit on the committee, and it was gradual and unglamorous and real, and I do not regret it. But Kepler's Reach was where the grain farmers were. The ones who had been waiting 6 months for their corridor to clear while the Arathi conclave ran customs delays. The restoration of Earth's member status had resolved that within 3 weeks of the vote, and the farmers had gotten their harvest through, and the following year the corridor had been formally reclassified as a priority agricultural route with guaranteed transit times under the new Resource Allocation Committee's first binding resolution, which I had drafted and which had passed with exactly the kind of majority that comes when 67 other junior member species suddenly realize they have a voting ally on a committee that previously operated without one. I went to Kepler's Reach for a ceremony. The farming cooperative in the Eastern Agricultural Zone had named a distribution hub after Amara Osei-Bonsu. It was not a dramatic building, a functional logistics center, the kind of structure that exists to be used and not to be looked at. But it had her name above the door, and her daughter had come from Nairobi for the dedication. And I stood in the back of the gathering on a clear afternoon and watched the farmers who had waited 6 months for a corridor to clear walk past the building that bore the name of the woman who had spent 22 years ensuring that the lever existed to clear it. Her daughter found me afterward. She said she would have hated the ceremony. Yes, I said. She would have spent the whole time checking the inventory manifests. She smiled. Then she said, she told us. Near the end, she said the hardest part was not the work. The work was clear. She said the hardest part was not knowing whether the people who came after her would understand what it was for. I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I think she knew, I said. I think she built it so that it would be impossible to misunderstand. I moved to Kepler's Reach 6 months later. I have a house at the edge of the Eastern Agricultural Zone, close enough to the distribution hub that I can see the loading lights from my porch on clear nights. The hub runs 23 hours a day. It is not glamorous. It is not designed to impress anyone. It processes about 340,000 metric tons of agricultural product per quarter and routes it through a council-designated priority corridor that now has a 4-hour transit guarantee. And it does this without drama and without incident and without anyone in the council's senior chambers spending much time thinking about it. That is precisely the point. My neighbor's daughter is 8 years old. Her name is Bia. And she has the specific quality of curiosity that 8-year-olds have when they have decided that a nearby adult is a reliable source of interesting information and have not yet learned to be polite about demanding it. She appeared at my fence one evening last autumn while I was sitting outside watching the hub lights, and she leaned on the fence post with the posture of someone who has a question and has been considering it for some time. My teacher said you were in the government, she said. Something like that, I said. She said you did something with aliens. Also, something like that. She considered this. What did you do? I thought about Amara and her whiteboard and her garden and the 41 years of work that could not be explained in a single sentence, and that had never, until 3 years ago, been visible to a single person outside of a classified facility. I helped make sure that the things people here needed could get to them, I said. Bay considered this with the serious expression of someone evaluating whether this answer is sufficient. That doesn't sound that hard, she said. No, I agreed. It doesn't. She seemed satisfied. She went back inside. I stayed on my porch, and the hub lights ran steady and bright in the distance, and above them, through the atmosphere and beyond it, somewhere in the distribution nodes and routing corridors and legal architectures of a galactic economy that had been built to exclude us and had discovered it could not function without us, 41 years of quiet, unglamorous, invisible human work continued to move the things that people needed from where they were to where they had to go. The council had deleted us from the record. We had been the record. They knew that now. And somewhere in a garden that no longer existed, under a desert that held no secrets anymore, a woman who had spent her life mapping what breaks first and who suffers when it does had been right about one thing above all others. The leverage was never in the weapon, it was always in the work.